Rigid and repetitive behavior. That is the topic on the Autism Outreach podcast today. Welcome to episode 138. I had a great conversation today with Dr. Jonathan Fernand. We talk all about what is considered rigid and repetitive behavior and when do these warrant intervention. I think this is something that's so very important to us listening in as speech therapists or BCBAs. He shares a lot of really wonderful insights and resources as well. If you are not sure who Dr. Jonathan Fernand is, he received his master's from the California State University, Sacramento, under the advisement of Dr. Becky Penrod, and his PhD from the University of Florida under the advisement of Dr. Timothy Vollmer. He's currently an assistant professor in the School of Behavior Analysis at the Florida Institute of Technology, and he has served as a reviewer of several journals, including the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis in Practice, Behavior and Philosophy, and the Analysis of Verbal Behavior. He is a sought-after speaker, and what I think is so amazing about Dr. Fernand is that he has worked and has experience in a variety of settings. So you know me, I worked in the schools and non-public programs for 20 years before stepping away to focus on ABA speech. So he has consulted in clinics and internationally in schools, large districts, rural districts, and he shares that insight today. I am absolutely thrilled that you are going to listen in to our conversation today.
You're listening to Autism Outreach Podcast, a podcast full of ready-to-use strategies to help those with autism strengthen their communication skills. Here's your host, Rose Griffin of ABA Speech, a speech therapist and board-certified behavior analyst who shares tips you can use in your next therapy session.
Thanks so much for joining us on episode 138. We have an amazing show for you today. We have with us Dr. Jonathan Fernand. Thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you on.
Well, it's a pleasure to be on, and thanks for inviting me.
And I was telling Jonathan before we pressed record that I think I came across his information on LinkedIn. I do talk about social media a lot here because that is how I disseminate. And sometimes I talk about TikTok, but today I'm talking about LinkedIn because there are so many amazing BCBAs that are on LinkedIn, and I have connected with so many just very smart people that I've brought on the podcast to talk about really important topics. So for those of us that are new to you and your work, can you tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what you're up to now?
Of course. Well, I love to talk about myself as an applied scientist, applied clinician, because I've worked with a variety of individuals with a variety of needs, diagnoses, and in a variety of different settings. So I have worked in a lot of places. Kind of that who am I, where have I gone? It, again, spans several years now. I sometimes don't like to admit. But my journey really started as a undergraduate psychology major. And I think this is a common story of, not knowing what I'm going to do with a bachelor's degree in psychology. And so I was looking for some applied experiences and, of course, started working early intervention for children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, was doing some in-home kind of therapy. And so really learned basic applied behavior analytic foundational principles through my on-the-job experiences. And I loved it. I gravitated to it really well. And I think it was the aha moment that my undergraduate experiences were lacking. It was just this, it made sense. And I saw this real world application and value for, individuals in need and how our science could help them build better lives for their own lenses, for quality purposes. And so I was hooked. That was my reinforcer, right? And fortunately at the time, so I was at the California State University, Sacramento, And at the time, they just so happened to hire 2 faculty to start a master's degree program in behavior analysis. And so I think timing all kind of came together really in a happenstance but beautiful way, and found myself applying to that program, fortunately got in. And I was studying under Dr. Kyle McGill and Becky Penrod. I was technically Becky Penrod's student. And so I got a lot of experiences from Kyo in verbal behavior, equivalence-based instruction, and early learner programming interventions for language. But as Becky's student, was really thrust into a world of learning how to assess and treat pediatric feeding disorders. And that's where my love of rigid and repetitive behavior really got its start. And so actually my master's thesis, I really wanted to design interventions for an OCD population in trying to, help individuals reduce some of the rigid and repetitive behavior that they may engage in. And of course, did not have access to that population. I was a little kind of naive as a young master's level student. And so really, I just pivoted that protocol for a lot of the kids that we were seeing with pretty severe food selectivity and other related feeding disorders. And was happy that happened because, again, saw how powerful our interventions can be for kids with, caloric and nutritional deficits. A lot of which were either G-tube or supplemental tube feeding required for them, or at least on the wait list, or at least coming up to getting one. And so maybe even preventing surgeries and things like that for that population. Which, if people are not aware, have not seen it, I think it's a very, very powerful tool or set of tools to assist individuals with severe medical problems. I was fortunate at several points in my time to also go and experience different settings. And so in my master's program, I spent 12 weeks at the New England Center for Children in Massachusetts. So I was working there with adolescents, young men in a residential care facility and day treatment program. Which, again, a very fantastic facility. And really nothing that I've ever seen replicated. It's amazing to see so many behavior analysts and other professionals under one roof, all with a very similar mission and goal for helping kids and individuals. So I spent some good time there, interacting with a variety of people who have remained lifelong mentors and friends. So I always give a shout out to that experience. I spent a lot of my time in my master's program assisting a lot of my peers with research. I was serving as a teaching assistant for several classes, and really found a love and passion for kind of this early mentorship that I was doing at the time. And I was having conversations with Dr. Penrod about, how can I scratch that itch a little bit? And she kind of urged me to apply for doctoral programs, or keep it in mind at least. And, I was very fortunate to have some early mentorship and kind of nudging me in different directions. Then, because at that point, it was not a thought in my head, and then it just never went away. And I ended up researching a lot of different institutions and potential faculty who I would be able to get along with and study with, and be in an environment that would be one for learning, right? Long story short, I found myself at the University of Florida with Dr. Timothy Vollmer, which could not have been a better place for me, I think, to thrive under his mentorship. Is single-handedly one of the most remarkable, kindest human beings on the face of the planet, and really was, I think, a really good fit for me. He has such a diverse research and clinical range that I was fortunate to be able to continue a lot of my feeding disorders work, but also continue. That's where I started working in school-based settings and school consultation with teachers and other administrators within rural school districts in the state of Florida. And started working with much more diverse populations within the school setting. I remember just different conduct disorder problems, working with selective mutism, all sorts of different things came our way. And that's where I actually started diving a lot more into some of the more rigid and repetitive behavior and flexible interests, sorts of challenges that many of the populations that I've been talking about so far engage in. So I had a tremendous experience there. I ended up staying on with Dr. Vollmer as a postdoc as well. That was funded by a partnership through the Florida Autism Centers. At the time, we were in a contractual relationship with them, and I think that has still continued with that group. But so I was actually traveling across the state of Florida to a lot of these center-based agencies and providing clinical consultation and continuing education and supervision, so forth. Mostly related to, again, rigid repetitive behavior. And I do include feeding disorders within that kind of umbrella as well. From there, I graduated and I stuck with academia. My first job was a small liberal arts school right outside of Chicago. And I was there for a few years. And then I recently, about 2 years ago, transitioned to my current position at the Florida Institute of Technology. So I'm now back in Florida, where I supervise lots of students at the master's and doctoral level within behavior analysis. And in partnership, we also have an on-campus clinic, the Scott Center, that I'm technically not affiliated with, but a lot of my students work at, and we do a lot of clinical work here as well. So I hope that answers your question. In terms of, in-home clinics, schools, hospital-based settings, residential facilities, children, adolescents, adults, variety of diagnoses. I have some students also working with individuals with Down syndrome now as well, but also do a lot of the work that I do now is not only assisting with families with those diagnosed or children with those diagnoses, but also the main thing that I do is consultation for staff and professionals. So I'm really working with mostly neurotypical adults. And then working with other people as well. So
that's amazing. And I hope everybody in your environment knows how lucky they are to be around you, because you have that experience. I have just a tiny little experience, but I also worked in the schools, as a speech therapist, BCBA, but I also worked in, when you said residential day schools, I worked in non-public programs for autistic learners who were usually male, were usually above the age of 15. So I feel like I'm on the same wavelength there. But I think it's great though, that you've been to New England Children's, which obviously I've heard a lot of great things about. And it's nice to have that experience though, because I'm sure as an amazing BCBA, you're able to see where somebody is at their baseline of learning about the science and how to help somebody, where sometimes people who are BCBAs, with how our field has grown so much, they may be working in a clinical role, consulting with a school, and have never, ever worked in a school setting. And so they may have some recommendations that don't have full support by the school staff. So you probably are really at an advantage there to be able to consult like that. But wow, that's really neat that you're consulting and that you've just seen so many different settings to be able to work with people, because working in a clinic or somewhere like New England Children's is going to be really different than working in a rural school in Florida. So thank you for sharing that. I loved listening to that. That's amazing. I love all the things that you've done. So today I saw you on LinkedIn that you did this talk about rigid and repetitive behaviors. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. And before I pressed record, we were talking about the fact that you have obviously collaborated with speech therapists and you work with speech therapists. So, speech therapists are often tasked with working with learners who engage in behavior that's a barrier to their learning, but rarely do we ever have any type of coursework that talks about that. We maybe I've been out 20 years now and been dually certified 12. So that's a big part of what I do, is share information about how to reach autistic learners. But can you just give us kind of a summary of various rigid and repetitive behaviors that we may see as clinicians, as speech therapists or BCBAs, because both groups listen in?
Yeah, I think what's challenging about rigid and repetitive behavior in terms of the definition is it's really an umbrella term.
Mm-hmm.
And there could be a multitude of different topographies or forms of behavior, from stereotyped or repetitive motor, vocal sorts of behavior, to this sort of inflexibility in terms of routines or ritualized patterns,
Mm-hmm.
or highly restricted interests, perseverations, so forth. And even within that kind of umbrella is also this hypofixation or sensory sort of input or interest as well. So, that very classical, I don't like the feelings of these types of sensations,
Mm-hmm.
loud noises or tactile senses and so forth. And there have been a number of people who have tried to classify these sorts of behaviors in different ways. And actually, the group that you mentioned that you saw that I presented to, we kind of talked about that classification system. There's a paper by Turner, I believe, Turner 1999, where they classified these topographies in terms of what they term lower order and higher order rigid and repetitive behavior, with that lower order really being these categories like self-injurious behavior actually is within there,
Mm-hmm.
and kind of more simplistic repetitive motor and vocal stereotypy. And those being different from maybe some verbally influenced or maybe some more rule-governed higher order behavior. And that would include compulsive, ritualistic, or restricted behavior. And these might be things like item arranging and ordering, insistence on sameness, like wearing the same clothes or certain types of clothing, or preoccupation with certain types of objects or subject matter, like, only wanting to talk about fans or garage doors or something like that. And much of our research, and especially in behavior analysis, has mostly been towards some of those lower order types of behaviors, especially the self-injurious behavior, which we have a long line of literature for, and then some of the motor and vocal stereotypies. But there's just a smattering on that, those other topographies like item arranging and ordering or insistence on sameness.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And so I'm curious because, as a speech therapist, and I am online all the time because I have an online business, but, there is this thought of, I'm interested when you think these behaviors warrant intervention, because speech therapists have a lot of people in their ear about different things and different theories about how we should help learners. And so I'm curious, when do we know, and I'm sure you're getting called out as a consultant. I always say this, I teach an ethics course here at Kent State for people becoming BCBAs, but I always say collaboration between SLPs and BCBAs is hard sometimes, because a lot of school districts are not going to call a BCBA in antecedently when things are going great just to build a rapport. They're going to call a BCBA in, unfortunately, when things are going really poorly. Maybe it's, contentious, litigious. There's advocates involved now, and then they want to sit in on your sessions. But it just goes, I'm just curious, when do we, because the way that I've been talking about problem behavior, and I don't know if it's right or wrong, and I'm sure when you have an online business, everybody has an opinion about what you're saying, but I always say, problem behavior that is a barrier to learning. So I think that is really hard too for obviously BCBAs, but they're thinking about behavior more. Speech therapists come into a session and they're like, I don't know, this kid won't engage. She's making all these vocalizations, and I don't know what to do about that. So I guess when do we know that this warrants intervention?
Yeah. Well, one, thank you for asking that question. I think it's a really important question. I think it's a really important, timely question within our field. And you just describing kind of that collaboration and like coming into a school district, I'm like, Rose, you're like, my history, right?
Yes, right.
You're absolutely right. That's when we get called in, and it's unfortunately sometimes a little too late to make some preemptive recommendations. But in terms of, and I like your description of, barrier to learning. And I think, we're in a really, and what I say right now in this moment is probably outdated in the next couple months, probably, right? I hope not necessarily, but I hope it has a little bit more longevity. But we're at the precipice of making some really informed decisions as a field as to what constitutes behavior change or what warrants behavior change. And I, of course, have some ideas, which I'm always open to feedback. And I feel like, like you said, there's always going to be somebody that has something to say about what you have to say. I recognize that. I don't like talking in absolutes, let's say. And that gets me to kind of this, every decision I make as a behavior analyst, as a clinician, is contextually driven, right? We pride ourselves on individualized instruction and interventions for the populations we serve. And so I can't really tell you, I don't have a person in front of me engaging in behavior. And I think there are some factors to weigh in on for when and how to treat. So that is me acknowledging that no, not every single rigid and repetitive behavior warrants treatment. Because not every single rigid and repetitive behavior is doing a disservice to that individual in some way, shape, or form. And so speaking to some of these topographies, for example, motor and vocal stereotypies may not be of concern. They may not be hindering that person's placement in a less restrictive environment, impacting the reinforcers that they're engaging in or trying to seek meaningful social interactions with other people. Their learning may not be disrupted. And most importantly, it is not likely serving a health and wellness problem. Unlike self-injurious behavior, which is, of course, a much more immediate health, safety, and wellness issue that is going to impact that individual's quality of life. Moving on to some of those other higher order rigid and repetitive behaviors, compulsive behavior, ritualistic behavior, again, it depends. These may be impacting that person's ability to function in a day-to-day life. We can think about the individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder who may not be able to hold down a job, who may not be able to make meaningful romantic relationships with people because the behaviors they're engaging in are serving as a barrier for those to blossom. But I hope those kind of examples kind of get to, again, I think we need to know a little bit more. I can't just say, should rigid and repetitive behavior be treated? Yes or no. It's a little bit more complex than that decision. And I think we need to lean into a little bit more of those conversations about, yes, have we probably as professionals implemented interventions when we should not have? I'm not going to be the first to say that, no, we've done everything right. But I also think that those interventions are sometimes warranted. Sometimes they're life-saving. And those are definitely, I think, situations where I don't think we have to shy away from having a rationale of why we're doing what we're doing. We should always have a rationale for why we're doing what we're doing, and be able to stand by that. The next caveat to that is, of course, there's and I think it's tied to this question, is the notion of assent and consent for treatment. And I think I won't get into great details. I know a whole other separate conversation.
Yes.
But it matters and it's important. And some people's ability to assent may be impacted in a variety of ways. They may not have they may have guardianship over their decisions. They may need assistance in a variety of ways to learn to advocate for themselves, and so may have other people advocating for them, and things like that. And that becomes its own challenge. But of course, we should be seeking towards, is this a goal area as well that is going to be meaningful for that person and that person's life? I think is at the crux of the assent and consent challenges that we have growing in our field right now. And of course, the answer should be yes, this will be meaningful. The third variable that I would say in here that often governs my decision-making is, to what extent and through what means are we going to attempt, when we do say it does warrant a decrease or intervention, will we go through? And I think oftentimes, with the exception of the health and safety types of topographies, all other topographies that don't pose a health and safety issue, does that behavior need to be decreased to 0 at all times? And usually the answer is no. Can this person engage in those behaviors? Yes. And I'll give an example. I've got a paper coming out soon on treating aggression that's related to item arranging and ordering. They're kids. These were kids and adults who engaged in some pretty severe item arranging and ordering, where literally just slight movements of anything in their environment would result in them aggressing towards caretakers or other people in the environment, so that they can just simply move it back and leave it be. So don't get me wrong, I'm just moved to a new office, actually. Love item arranging and ordering.
Right.
Very soon when they patch some holes. And hopefully nobody is going to not allow me to do that, right? It's, I think, a context where hopefully it's pretty appropriate for me to put my books where I want them. And things like that. They're individuals who are moving other people without their consent, are moving other people's items that don't belong to them, who are going into the community and moving things in the grocery store, department stores, and so forth, where, again, can we have some conversations with community providers about to what extent we can allow that and be accommodating for individuals? Yeah. And so in this article, we didn't treat the item arranging and ordering directly. We were mostly concerned with the aggression that resulted from kind of disrupting that activity. But definitely contexts and situations where, sometimes you can't do those things. And not just the people we're providing those services to, but anybody wouldn't be able to do that. So, for example, one of the individuals we worked with was, I believe, 14 at the time. And, she was bigger than I was actually at 14, and kind of blindly would just barrel down through anybody to get back to, whatever item. And sometimes those items were really unpredictable. Like I had no clue that is what you wanted arranged until you engaged in this behavior. And so there was some safety issues with, kind of engaging in that level of perseveration and insistence. So we kind of were working more on kind of a tolerance to periods in which that might not be available or available immediately and so forth. And, again, I think thinking about to what extent or under what circumstances might we have a treatment in place versus maybe more free access or opportunities to engage in behavior that clearly, these individuals find reinforcing and pleasurable and so forth. We get to, sometimes I get to maybe play video games or something like that, but I can't play video games at work, right?
Right.
So we kind of have to have that balance of, when is this available versus not available? And that was kind of maybe the beginnings of designing some treatments towards promoting that kind of learning.
Okay. So, yeah. And I think that's so important to talk about. I think that if you haven't worked in a non-public program, you don't understand how severe and just unsafe. Like when you said it's a matter of life or death, or, it really is. But if you haven't worked with individuals who engage in that type of behavior, I think it's good to talk about, because even if it's like maybe a low level here, and then maybe it's never treated, and then somebody's not able to speak, and then they're 16, 17, 18, like I've seen that progression. I know you have too. So I think it's good just to talk about that, because there are a lot of people who really benefit from these interventions. I think sometimes online we see a lot of, well, at least I do, anti-ABA sentiment from speech therapists. But this is just really such important work you're doing. Oh, I'm excited about that. So was one of the interventions in that article talking about teaching a learner that they may have access to that behavior at a certain time? Or Dr. Carbone used to have this idea. I think it was called STEM City or something. It was like a little carpet. And I don't even know if but it was like, it was okay at that time to do that thing. I mean, it's kind of, in my clinician mind, it's a little parallel to that. It's not saying like maybe it's it's not decreased to zero, because maybe on some level it brings somebody joy. But it's teaching, it's a time or place, because I can see, in knowing learners like this, that's why I wanted to have you come on, is that, this could really be a barrier to somebody accessing instruction, the community. And what happens when learners get so much older is their world and their caregivers' worlds, if they're not in a group home, becomes so very small that they may never be able to go out into the community if they engage in these behaviors, because it's unsafe for them and unsafe for the community, really. So was that one of the interventions that you will discuss in that article?
Yeah, close. I'll come back to that. I'm going just before it leaves my brain. I think you are also still talking about, kind of, again, when to treat, and that these things are sometimes they are dangerous, and prioritization of not only what kind of challenging behaviors warrant treatment, but also prioritization of what types of interventions might be used and at what points. So I think, and that may change. So in early development, you might see maybe signs of rigid and repetitive behavior, insistence on sameness, but it may not be a huge issue at that point, right? The young kids that I work with aren't like that teen that I described who's would absolutely run out into traffic, like with no kind of regard of where they're at. And that becomes a much more challenging problem than our kind of young one at the start. And then it also, as me as a clinician, thinking about predicting where that young child is going to go in terms of trajectory. And at what point does this become a more challenging problem that may warrant additional intervention approaches and so forth. And so really what I wanted to speak to with that is you're essentially conducting a risk-benefit analysis at that point, right? And that may change as that child develops, as they learn new skills, as new problems change and evolve over time. And I need to kind of revisit my plan and my prioritization. So I wanted to speak to that before we got off of it. But in our article that's coming out, we took essentially a functional communication training sort of approach. So it's kind of getting to that, what you kind of described as almost like a multiple schedule arrangement. where, we might have periods of time in which that reinforcer is not available or delivered for behavior, and then times when it might be. And we kind of took the beginnings of that. So we basically taught individuals to request when I move things in their environment or I disrupt their ongoing kind of routine, essentially to request access back to it. And again, our main goal there was not for decreasing the rigid repetitive behavior itself, is that when I did that, they engaged in some pretty severe aggression towards me, right? So I essentially wanted to change the aggression piece of it, which of course we have a long-standing literature of, we can easily replace those types of problem behavior with communication. And we're pretty good at that. So we did that. And then we essentially started delaying the reinforcer, which was access back to those items to be moved in some way, shape, or form. And through that delay, we started seeing, and we unfortunately didn't measure this in our article or our research because we didn't anticipate it necessarily or think that was going to be one of the outcomes. But we essentially started seeing for some kids, they essentially kind of quote unquote moved on. The item that was arranged or moved or situation that they were so invested in and invested in enough to engage in some pretty severe emotional responding or aggression towards when it initially was happening, it was not serving as an EO anymore for, once you delayed it kind of 30 to 60 seconds or so. And then they did have access to kind of arranging again, or moving things or engaging in their routine. But they essentially started just doing other things, engaging in appropriate play with other toys and interacting appropriately with us and things like that. So we're hoping to do some follow-ups where we'll do some measurement of those sorts of things. But was kind of those beginning stages, like you said, of carving out some time of right now, it's just not available for at least momentary purposes. And then, signaling when it is available for them to engage in those behaviors.
Okay. Wonderful. And I feel like we could talk forever about, assessment and treatment, and it's so individualized. And I feel like if I had a child of my own or a client that engaged in this, I'd be like, Dr. Fernand, I think you need to come to a consult here in Ohio, because I just feel like it's so nuanced and you have such a wealth of information that I could see people kind of, you have to be really careful with these types of interventions. I feel like it could go awry, and I'm sure you get called on those types of consultations too. And I think that's the thing about the field that is so, it's hard because we're growing so rapidly, the field of ABA. And I feel like that people are not analyzing things to the minutia that, I would go hear Dr. Iwata talk and, Dr. Greg now. And like, I just really love to talk to people who are so invested in the field and analyze and are doing research just like yourself. But I feel like some new BCBAs maybe are not taking in all this information. But so if any BCBAs are listening and they are newer, do you have any resources or support where they could learn? Because like you've said SIB a couple of times. So self-injurious behavior, if you're a speech therapist listening, you're not aware. I know what that is because I would treat, students, I would from the communication side of things. But I feel like if we're not aware of these behaviors, that we really need to, that idea of, competency and things like that. So if there are BCBAs that are listening and they want to increase their competency in these types of areas, do you have any suggestions on, I know you mentioned one article before where they kind of classified things, but I feel like this is an area where people probably really need to kind of hunker in and learn more.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think we've got some challenges with, so many people entering our field within the last 3 to 5 years, that we do have kind of a really early young workforce right now. And so I think I'm optimistic about some of the kind of systems and, governance changes that are happening as we grow and develop, to hopefully, bolster some of that. But I think there are some great supervision and competency articles out there that I think when you take those from like a general recommendation standpoint, a lot of them being produced Linda LeBlanc, Tyra Sellers. I think Matt Broadhead speaks a lot about competence and ethics. Those are some key names I think to look out for in terms of building competency. And I think the more that I experience, the more I start to value really hands-on experience. So I oftentimes tell my students, especially, they're all right at that graduation period. And, our graduation actually this summer is next Saturday. And so, we have students who are so gung-ho that upon graduation, they're going to sit and get their BCBA, they're going to pass that exam, and they're going to open up their own clinic. And I really encourage them that we as a field should really pride ourselves on and value a continuous education model. And I try to model that with myself of, I've got this continued competence model where I'm still learning as well. I'm still developing, and I still have to get my own CEUs. That doesn't stop at any point. And that I need to take that seriously, that I really, don't want to be that person that, just clocks in and clocks out and those boxes. That I really am invested in my own learning and development, because things are changing and things are changing rapidly. And we talked about several areas, at least within rigid and repetitive behavior, where, in the next several years, I think there will be more literature on decision-making models for when and how to treat some of these behaviors, and different interventions that are not currently published. I saw one that's coming out, where we can hopefully make informed decisions based off of the science that we're developing in the now. And so that really, to me, speaks to get mentorship, and reach out to people, read articles, contact those authors and ask for resources. Don't be shy about that. So I'll plug my, I'm on LinkedIn, and of course people are welcome to find me there, but ResearchGate is a lovely tool. And, we are, of course, if you're members of many of our major organizations, you now have much more access to literature than you ever did before. I remember there was a time where no, that was not the case, but yet you were still supposed to stay up to date on things. So I'm very optimistic about our current state of the field in terms of research access. But oftentimes you can find articles that you did not have access to necessarily through Google. Various research sites like ResearchGate, and things like that, or just contacting the author to see if you can have a copy of that manuscript or article, even if they don't have access to it, they may be able to provide you with access somehow to it. I often have colleagues where, even my own university resources are sometimes limited, and I can, of course, do an interlibrary loan or something like that if we don't have access to something. But it's way easier and faster if sometimes I have a friend at a different institution that may be able to find that article for me, and just have, again, a network of resources and people who can assist you with building that competency, I think is a really important thing that I value, and I usually try to impart on the people I talk with. So always have somebody around you, whether that's a peer mentor or a supervisor that you feel like you can grow from, is my mantra.
Yes, I love that. And I love the idea of, I have always said I'm a lifelong learner. At one point, after I got my BCBA, I think I had one child at that time. My husband was like, "You're not going back to school, are you?" So I was like, "No," but I just started my own business. Now we're starting this membership. I'm thinking it will be launched by the time this comes out. It's called the ABA Speech Connection, but we offer ASHA and ACEs to kind of build that collaboration. And I love the idea of that continuous education model, that we are lifelong learners. And I hope the field continues to grow that way. And I try to model and disseminate that way too. I actually had the honor of presenting here in Ohio about SLP BCBA collaboration. And right before us was Dr. Heward. He was talking, about his book and behavior contracts. And then I didn't realize he likes to he goes to all the talks. I mean, you talk about somebody who's a lifelong learner. He's there, he's taking notes. He was interactive during my talk. I was like, oh my goodness, this is like my life moment. It was great. So I love to learn like that too. So such a great chat with you today. I'm excited about that article that's coming out. It was nice to connect. Where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, like I said, I'm on LinkedIn and of course ResearchGate as well. Those are my two primary places. But of course, you can also email me. I'm happy to point you to either my own work and the work that might be on our university website or things like that. Or I will happily converse with you about other people's work that I know of too, and at least point you to the resources that you might need. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It was great to connect.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Autism Outreach. If you enjoyed the show today, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode full of actionable strategies you can use in your therapy room. Write a review too. That would mean so much to me. I always love hearing from you. Have a specific topic that you want included on a future show? Reach out over on Instagram, ABA Speech by Rose, or visit me at www.abaspeech.org.